Hello and welcome to my channel, dear viewers. Today I'll be sharing two chilling stories that shocked even seasoned detectives. We'll dive into dark and terrifying events that truly happened, nothing made up by an AI. These are crimes that stunned the public and left many questions unanswered. Make yourselves comfortable. It's going to be both scary and fascinating. On September 4th, 2001, around 3 in the morning, a fire suddenly erupted in an apartment building located in Hwayangdong, Gwangjin District, Seoul. At first glance, it seemed like a minor incident, but a sense of alarm spread quickly among the residents. There was a real danger the flames could consume the entire building. However, thanks to the prompt response of the firefighters, the fire was contained, and soon it was extinguished. Fortunately, the damage was minimal, with only traces of soot on the walls and a faint smell of burning left to hint at what had happened. Yet when the firefighters entered the building to investigate the source of the blaze, they encountered something far more disturbing than the fire itself. In the bedroom, lying motionless on the bed, was the body of a woman who showed no signs of life. Her name was Jeong, and she was 31 years old, an office worker who lived in the area. At first glance, her body bore no visible wounds or injuries that might suggest the cause of death. However, specialists determined that her death had been caused by suffocation. There were marks on her neck, indicating that she had been strangled. It was a horrifying discovery, but the real shock awaited the rescuers as they examined the scene more closely. They soon noticed that the woman was missing her lower clothing, and her body showed signs of sexual assault. Investigators suggested that the perpetrator had used a cosmetics bottle to simulate the act of violence, leaving the victim with severe injuries. The picture grew darker and more chilling with each detail. Furthermore, the apartment was in complete disarray. The scene suggested a possible burglary. Items were scattered and furniture was moved, as though someone had frantically searched every room, trying to find something valuable. Several of the victim's personal belongings were missing from the apartment where the murder took place. Her wallet, identification card, 20,000 won in cash, a handbag, and even her underwear, which the perpetrator appeared to have taken. All evidence pointed to an intruder who had entered the home with the clear intent to rob, potentially already planning the assault. After carrying out his intentions, the criminal likely set the blanket and scattered clothes on fire, attempting to destroy evidence, erase any possible traces, and make his capture more difficult before hastily fleeing the scene. The police immediately began an active search for suspects, focusing on those who had previously been convicted of similar crimes. Simultaneously, investigators checked for any similar incidents in the area, hoping to find common descriptions or details that might lead them to a suspect. Unfortunately, despite all their efforts, not a single substantial lead could be found. Even the crime scene seemed to hold no answers. No DNA traces or other evidence were left behind that could have become a key to solving this dreadful case. Everything pointed to the perpetrator's careful planning to cover his tracks. Soon, the investigation reached a dead end, and regrettably, the case remained unsolved for many years. 8 years later, on September 26, 2009, early in the morning around 4 o'clock, police were patrolling the streets of a residential area in Gwangjin District, Seoul. Officers were carefully monitoring public order ahead of the Chuseok holiday when their attention was drawn to a man in a jacket, wandering aimlessly down a dark alley. At first glance, he was an unremarkable person, appearing to be around 30 years old, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a receding hairline. Nevertheless, his behavior at such a late hour seemed suspicious, and the officers decided to stop him. "Excuse me, could you stop for a moment?" They addressed the man with polite insistence, asking him to show identification. The man did not seem to object and immediately pulled out his documents. However, the officers immediately noticed an odd discrepancy. "This isn't you, is it?" one of the officers remarked in surprise, noting that the photo in the document did not match the man's appearance at all. If the photo in the ID did not match the man's appearance at all, immediately raising suspicion among the officers and prompting them to notice other peculiar details. They began to ask additional questions, attempting to obtain his name and phone number, but he either stumbled over his answers or was entirely unable to provide a coherent explanation. He couldn't give them his real name or any information that might verify his identity. Growing suspicious, the officers, realizing they were dealing with someone concealing something, suggested he accompany them to the station for further questioning. Upon arrival at the police station, new details emerged that only deepened the mystery. During a search, the man was found to have not one, but 3 mobile phones. While this might not typically raise alarm, each phone was registered under a different person's name. Moreover, records showed that one of the phones had been reported stolen. At this point, the police began to suspect that they might have an ordinary thief on their hands, possibly someone involved in small-time thefts, specializing in stealing mobile phones and personal belongings. However, their expectations began to shift as they continued searching through his belongings and came across a set of car keys. "Let's check the car," one of the officers suggested, unaware that this idea would lead them to an even more shocking discovery. They went together with the man to the location where the car was parked and began their inspection. Soon, the moment came to look into the trunk, and what they found there surpassed even their most troubling guesses. Inside were around 20 pairs of women's underwear, 6 knives, an external hard drive, and even various sexual toys. But the particular focus of the officers fell on the panties themselves. On each of the items of women's underwear, in the intimate areas, holes had been cut out, suggesting peculiar inclinations of the owner. The police immediately understood that they were dealing with far more than an ordinary criminal. This man, who was 36 years old and whose name was Lee Dae-hyuk, was becoming increasingly suspicious. His behavior continued to surprise them. Throughout the entire inspection, he maintained a calm demeanor and even held himself with confidence, as though he had not the slightest reason to worry. When the police, without hiding their disgust, asked about the items they had found, he simply looked at them and, noticing their reaction, replied with absolute calm, "Oh, I have a sexual disorder." The simplicity of Lee Dae-hyuk's words struck them, and in his gaze there was not a trace of embarrassment or remorse, as though such behavior was entirely normal for him. Lee Dae-hyuk, as if it were something entirely ordinary, claimed that all the women's underwear found in his car was something he had just picked up while walking down the street. He insisted that he had stumbled upon these items by chance, and for some reason decided to keep them. Naturally, the police couldn't simply accept his explanation. Given the discoveries and his strange behavior, they decided to check his criminal history. The results were not long in coming. It was revealed that Lee Dae-hyuk already had a prior record. In 2006, he had been detained for indecent behavior in public. This fact only intensified their suspicions, and they decided to continue the investigation. The police paid particular attention to the external hard drive found in Lee Dae-hyuk's trunk, and deciding to inspect its contents, they connected the drive to a computer. However, what they saw on the screen exceeded all their expectations. Even the folder names were shocking. They were so obscene. The officers quickly realized that they were looking at something far more significant than a random collection of files. Opening folder after folder, investigators found pornographic materials, photographs of women's underwear, and pictures of Lee Dae-hyuk himself wearing that very underwear. Additionally, the drive contained secretly taken photos of women's body parts, which he had snapped on the street without their knowledge. But the most astonishing and shocking discovery was that among the files were scans of others' identification cards, 23 in total. This find immediately changed the course of the investigation. The police promptly began to identify the owners of these identification cards, contacting people whose documents had been scanned and stored on the hard drive. It turned out that most of these individuals had recently been victims of various crimes. Some reported wallet thefts, others had lost their identification cards, and some recounted assaults and robberies during which they lost their documents. However, until now, none of the perpetrators of these crimes had been apprehended. The police, upon finding within the scanned IDs one that belonged to a woman who had died long ago, could not escape a sense of horror. This document belonged to the victim of that unsolved murder in Gwangjin district from September 2001, when a woman named Jeong had lost her life. At that moment, the suspicion that Lee Dae-hyuk might be involved not only in petty thefts and assaults but something far darker, took on an entirely new, chilling tone. Now, the officers began to suspect that they were possibly sitting across from the very perpetrator of a brutal murder that had gone unsolved for years. Sensing that Lee Dae-hyuk might be their primary suspect, the detectives intensified their questioning, applying more pressure in hopes of breaking him into a confession. Yet, Lee Dae-hyuk remained imperturbable and unbreakable. He stubbornly insisted that he had no connection to the murder, claiming that he had simply found the ID by chance and couldn't understand why they were trying to pin the crime on him. In the eyes of the police, these words seemed more like manipulation than truth, but Lee Dae-hyuk skillfully dodged their questions, repeatedly pointing to the lack of evidence, and with a chilling composure, asserted that his involvement in the case could not be proven. Realizing that direct accusations were leading nowhere, one of the investigators decided to use a different approach, suspecting that a personal conversation might be the key to unsettling Lee Dae-hyuk's usual equilibrium. He asked his colleagues to leave the interrogation room, remaining alone with the suspect. Addressing Lee Dae-hyuk in a confidential tone, the investigator spoke to him as one person to another, suggesting they set aside the murder discussion and simply talk. Lee Dae-hyuk, who initially seemed reserved and cautious, began to open up gradually, drawn into the conversation. The investigator listened patiently, without interrupting, allowing Lee Dae-hyuk to express himself and release what had long been weighing on him. He spoke of grievances and injustices that had gnawed at him for years, of the humiliation he had faced, and how, in his view, he had been unfairly treated. All the while, the investigator listened, biding his time, not rushing to shift the topic to the main issue. This conversation spanned an incredible 12 hours. 12 hours of uninterrupted exchange, where the investigator fostered an atmosphere of trust, gradually penetrating the criminal's mind, delving into his inner world to create conditions where he might reveal himself. After these long hours of intense conversation, Lee Dae-hyuk finally relaxed, feeling something akin to closeness, a sense of trust he hadn't experienced in a long time. Perhaps for the first time in many years, he felt understood, heard, as though the person sitting across from him wasn't an investigator, but an older brother to whom he could confess his darkest secrets. Taking a heavy breath, Lee Dae-hyuk broke the silence, saying he was ready to be honest, but only with him. Almost in a whisper, he admitted that he had killed a woman in the past. This moment became a turning point. The mystery that had persisted for 8 years finally came to light. It turned out that Lee Dae-hyuk was indeed the very killer the police had been searching for. He began recounting how he had deliberately stalked his victim, a woman with the surname Jeong, and how, on that fateful day, he had entered her home while she slept. Afterward, he committed an act of sexual violence against her and then strangled her to avoid being exposed. Wanting to destroy evidence and mislead investigators, he set fire to some belongings, attempting to create the impression that it was a routine burglary. As the investigator and his colleagues listened to the confession, they couldn't help but wonder, if Lee Dae-hyuk confessed to this murder so easily, could it be his only crime? Was it possible that his first act of violence occurred in 2001? Or had he already committed similar crimes that the police were not yet aware of? It became clear that Lee Dae-hyuk had been entrenched in a life of crime for a long time, and his past was filled with numerous robberies and assaults. One of these crimes left a particularly deep mark. In this instance, he struck his victim with a blunt object, causing serious injury. The victim, a man of about 30 years, was left in an extremely critical condition, barely surviving. Analyzing the data from his previous crimes, the police noted that Lee Dae-hyuk often operated in the Cheongnam district area. This led investigators to consider re-examining unsolved cases in hopes of identifying possible connections to this area, and to Lee Dae-hyuk himself. The case that garnered particular attention was a murder that had taken place on Mount Aisan back in 1995. This horrifying crime occurred on October 19th in the Cheonggok-dong area, near the well-known spring on the slopes of Aisan. The body of the deceased woman, surnamed Kim, was discovered by chance. A schoolboy who had come to the spring for water stumbled upon it. Something strange, perhaps an odor or an unnatural silence, raised his suspicions. And as he looked around, he suddenly found the mutilated corpse. The sight of the woman's body shocked even those who first arrived on the scene. She was entirely naked, and it appeared she had been dragged across the ground, as her upper body was marked with deep scratches and signs of rough handling. Yet the most horrifying detail was something else. In her intimate area, a tree branch had been found, indicating the depraved cruelty of the killer. It was later revealed that the woman, Kim, had disappeared only a day before she was found, around 6 in the evening on October 18th, when she went to the spring for water and never returned. From the outset, investigators believed this could have been the work of a sexually deviant criminal. However, despite an active investigation and the collection of evidence, they were unable to find any trace of a suspect. The case grew cold, remaining unsolved and raising even more questions. Now, years later, after studying Lee Dae-hyuk's connections to the area and the similarities in the violent patterns, investigators began to suspect that this old murder might also be on his conscience. The method of perverse treatment of the body was eerily similar to the methods Lee Dae-hyuk had already displayed. The police decided to conduct an additional interrogation, this time acting more insistently, increasing the pressure and checking him on every detail. As a result, after prolonged and intense conversations, Lee Dae-hyuk finally confessed. He was the very person who had committed this brutal murder 8 years ago. In 1995, Lee Dae-hyuk, just returned from the army at the age of 23, went to Mount Aisan to spend some time in solitude, take a walk, and perhaps clear his mind. Upon reaching the spring, he decided to refresh himself, splashing water around as it flew in all directions. It was at this moment that his future victim, a woman named Kim, happened to be nearby. According to Lee Dae-hyuk's later recollection, her reaction was disapproving and sharp. She scolded him, pointing out that this water was for drinking and that he was wrong to wash himself in it. In her voice, as Lee Dae-hyuk claimed, he sensed a tone of harsh reproach. Her words allegedly affected him deeply, especially when she added something about his lack of manners, which instantly triggered a flash of uncontrollable rage in him. This burst of rage was so overwhelming that, without hesitation, he grabbed the nearest rock and struck Kim on the head with such force that she cried out and immediately fell to the ground. Fortunately for him, there were no witnesses nearby at that moment. He was alone, and his defenseless victim lay before him. Without thinking, he dragged her body roughly 20 meters toward some bushes and left it there, out of sight of any passers-by. Lee Dae-hyuk insisted that the murder had occurred solely due to a sudden burst of anger, and assured the investigators that there was no sexual intent in his actions. However, the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the victim's body suggested otherwise. Kim was found undressed, and her intimate area showed signs of injury. In response to this, Lee Dae-hyuk explained that his actions with the body were part of a cunning plan he devised after the murder to mislead investigators, hoping they would believe the crime had a sexual motive rather than being a result of impulsive violence. This story held even more peculiarities. Lee Dae-hyuk had taken his victim's underwear. This had become part of his own dark fascination. Later, it was revealed that after each crime, he would take women's underwear as a trophy to remind him of his deeds. This disturbing fascination had grown into a collection, and, as the police discovered, his trunk contained 23 IDs and women's underwear belonging to his victims. Experts analyzing Lee Dae-hyuk's behavior noted that he regarded these items as his trophies. He kept them for many years, almost obsessively, and perhaps derived a certain pleasure from the fact that he possessed them. Who was this man, who could appear absolutely normal but hid dark and dangerous sides within his soul? Lee Dae-hyuk was born in 1973, and his childhood unfolded in a large family. He was one of 6 children from his parents' second marriage. According to his own account, when he was still a young boy, merely a 3rd grader in elementary school, he faced a tragedy that may have initiated the chain of later events. One day, he went to the popular spring on Mount Aisan, where, he claimed, he became the victim of brutal violence at the hands of a stranger. This incident, which was never confirmed and remained only his story, was mentioned by Lee Dae-hyuk as a turning point, something that, he believed, affected his life and possibly damaged his psyche from a young age. Over time, as a teenager, Lee Dae-hyuk, unable to cope with his dark memories, developed not just curiosity but a painful obsession with obscene and perverse things. However, he wasn't interested in ordinary materials. He needed things connected to violence. He sought out child pornography and so-called snuff films that depicted scenes of suicide or murder. For an ordinary person, such materials would be revolting, but for Lee Dae-hyuk, they seemed to satisfy a certain thirst for darkness and violence. This craving for the forbidden only grew, and as he grew older, he moved from merely watching such materials to action. His new interest became women's underwear, which he not only collected but almost like a fetish, stole, transforming it into a symbol or trophy of his inner world. But his behavior didn't stop there. Gradually, he began acting more provocatively, engaging in lewd acts right outside girls' schools, where he brazenly displayed himself as the so-called flasher. Yet even after these actions, he was only detained for minor offenses. For example, a robbery in 1998, the theft of underwear in 2002, and public exposure in 2006, when the police stopped him 3 times. These minor offenses left a trail, but for many of those around him, he remained the ordinary neighbor. Neighbors who were aware of his odd behavior still saw him as just a man in his early 30s and considered him almost invisible. But no one knew that this ordinary man was living a double life. Moreover, since 2004, Lee Dae-hyuk had been in a common-law marriage with a woman named Miss Cho. To her, Lee Dae-hyuk was a completely different person, and when the truth emerged, she couldn't believe it. Her voice was filled with bitterness and confusion. "This isn't the man I knew." She couldn't comprehend that the man she had considered close and calm turned out to be a criminal with a horrifying past. And so, Dae-hyuk was sentenced in December 2009, when the long-awaited trial finally concluded. The verdict was harsh, fully reflecting the severity of the crimes he had committed. Lee Dae-hyuk was convicted of the brutal murders of 2 women, numerous robberies, and other offenses. The court sentenced him to 22 years and 6 months in prison, noting that his actions were marked by extraordinary cruelty and bore a distinctively perverse nature, adding to the gravity of his crimes. Prosecutors emphasized that all of his offenses carried an explicit sexual undertone, making them even more horrifying. All these factors favored a strict sentence. However, when issuing the verdict, the court considered mitigating circumstances. In particular, it was noted that Lee Dae-hyuk had confessed to his guilt and expressed remorse, stating that he understood the horrific consequences of his actions. Additionally, the court considered the complexities of his difficult family background, and Lee Dae-hyuk's own claims that he had allegedly experienced abuse as a child when he was in elementary school. The court believed that these factors might have significantly influenced his subsequent deviant behavior, although the actual claim of childhood abuse remained unproven, and some doubted its veracity. Despite this, the claim still influenced the court's decision. After the verdict was handed down, it was revealed that Lee Dae-hyuk, after serving his sentence, might be released around the age of 50. This news raised concerns among many experts and observers, who noted the potential danger of Lee Dae-hyuk returning to society. They expressed fears that a man who had displayed such a strong inclination toward cruelty and sexual perversions might still pose a threat to others, even after such a long time in confinement. To conclude this challenging story, it is worth highlighting the significant role the investigator played in the capture of Lee Dae-hyuk. According to Lee Dae-hyuk himself, his confession to murder became possible only because of an unusual attachment that developed between him and the investigator. Lee Dae-hyuk shared that, throughout his life, no one had ever shown him such genuine interest and attention. He claimed that because of this unique approach, he felt for the first time that someone truly wished to understand him, rather than simply accuse him. This investigator became for him something like the only person he could trust, and this trust allowed him to open up fully. Lee Dae-hyuk even admitted that he had almost fallen in love with him, and it was this affection that gave him the strength to make a full confession. In truth, the work on this case became an example of extraordinary skill and professionalism within the police force, thanks to which the criminal was exposed and brought to justice. The routine police patrol, which, due to their professional intuition, decided to stop a suspicious man on the street, played a crucial role in the chain of events that led to the solving of these grave crimes. Then came the investigator, who, even in the presence of evidence, managed to convince Lee Dae-hyuk of the importance of an honest confession. The efforts of all these individuals became the foundation on which Lee Dae-hyuk was apprehended and his crimes revealed. For their invaluable work and persistence, they deserve only the most sincere gratitude. And now, understanding how complex the journey to apprehend Lee Dae-hyuk was, one can only hope that he will be isolated from society for a long time. If such a person, whose crimes were marked by extreme cruelty and perversion, were to return to freedom, The threat of similar horrors looming over society might rise once again. We're moving on to the second story, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the first one in the comments. It's important to me to see these events through your eyes. Do you think murder can ever be a matter of honor? Certainly not. Yet, in certain Islamic cultures, there exists a disturbing and horrific tradition of killing one's loved ones under the guise of protecting family honor. The reasons behind such killings vary: refusal of an arranged marriage, rape, accusations of infidelity, and the list goes on. These brutal murders are cloaked in the concept of honor, but in reality, there is no justification for them. Some may think these are customs of a bygone era. Unfortunately, even today, people continue to lose their lives in the name of honor. Let's begin the story. In February of 2022, only 2 years ago, an image surfaced on an Iranian website, shocking Iranian society. The photo spread rapidly through social media, inciting horror around the world. In the picture was a man, smiling broadly at the camera. Even more horrifying, he held a machete in his right hand and a human head in his left. Phones at the police station were inundated with calls. A man is walking down the street with a severed head. Police were dispatched immediately, but the perpetrator had already fled the scene. Fortunately, with the help of numerous witnesses, they organized a chase. 4 hours later, the fugitive was apprehended. His attitude was shocking. He behaved as if he had done nothing wrong. The man arrested by the police was Sajjad Hidari. He calmly confessed to the police, "We had family problems, so I killed my wife." The head he had been carrying belonged to his wife, Mona Hidari, whom he had beheaded himself. Sajjad Hidari declared that he had been forced to act in order to restore his honor. He claimed that killing his wife was an honorable act, and that it was not an isolated incident in their community. There was not a shred of remorse or regret in his words. But were they truly a married couple? Let's go back 6 years to 2016. Before us is a young girl, waiting sadly for her wedding day. Her name is Mona Hidari, and she is just 12 years old. She looks dejected and unhappy, while her family is brimming with joy and anticipation. The entire town is preparing for the celebration. Soon the groom arrived at the wedding, Sajjad Hidari, visibly thrilled. Did no one notice an odd detail? The bride and groom share the same last name, Hidari. This is because Mona and Sajjad were first cousins. To us, this may seem strange, but in some Islamic countries, marriages between cousins are customary. For Mona, this was an unwanted marriage, one forced upon her by her family, leaving her deeply despondent. And soon they were officially married. Though Mona had entered this union at an extremely young age, it seemed that perhaps with time, her life might improve if the marriage proved to be a happy one. But her trials were only just beginning. At home, Sajjad Hidari became a tyrant. He disregarded Mona's voice entirely. Everything had to be done according to his wishes. The young bride found herself virtually confined, bound to obey his every demand, even in the most intimate aspects of their lives. Yet this was only the surface. Sajjad routinely subjected Mona to violence. On the days he drank, the brutality became unbearable. Mona, who had never wanted this marriage in the first place, could no longer endure the constant assaults and beatings. In desperation, with no other escape in sight, she decided to run away. But where could a girl so young go? The only place she could turn to was her parents' home. There, in tears, she begged them for help. Yet her parents' response was chillingly cold. "This is how it always is in a marriage," they told her. "He's not even asking for a divorce, so what's the problem? Don't bring shame upon our family." In Islamic countries, divorce is often viewed extremely negatively. It's not merely a separation between a man and a woman. It's a stain on the entire family's honor. This is why Mona endured her husband's brutality for so long. Even after her attempt to escape, her parents refused to support her, forcing her to return to her tormentor. Each time Mona returned home, she knew another monstrous beating awaited her, but she had no choice. Every time the ordeal repeated, her parents would simply say, "It's no big deal," and send her back to Sajjad. What Mona was going through had nothing to do with any normal relationship one might imagine. In the second year of her marriage, in 2018, Mona became pregnant, and at the age of only 14, she gave birth to a son. But even the birth of their child did not change anything. Sajjad continued to beat Mona, and the worst part was that he even started hitting their young son. Exhausted, Mona began to dream more and more of divorce. When her son turned 3, she could no longer bear it. Resolute, she planned everything carefully and fled Iran with her son, leaving her husband behind. Her last 5 years of marriage had been filled with pain and suffering, yet even then her parents did not support her. Mona desperately needed help, but her parents kept turning her away. It was during this time that Mona met a Syrian man whom we will call Amir. They began communicating actively online, growing close over time. Amir was always there to comfort and support Mona during her hardships. Although they were far apart, they dreamed of a day when they could be together. When Mona decided to escape, Amir helped her arrange everything and soon joined her. When Sajjad learned of his wife's escape, his fury knew no bounds. He immediately informed her parents. The family was in shock, but soon that shock turned into anger. Not only did she demand a divorce, but now she's run off with another man, they said. The family and relatives were united in their verdict. She has dishonored our name. She must be found and punished. After a long silence, Mona's father, Javad, finally spoke up, firmly saying, "I will bring my daughter back myself." Javad filed a missing persons report for his daughter Mona, gathered the necessary documents, hired a translator, and set off in search of her. He questioned everyone who might know where she had gone, but locating her was difficult since she had disappeared into another country. However, all of Javad's efforts were not driven by love or concern for his daughter's safety. His true motivation was to restore the family's honor. Consider this. Javad knew Mona had suffered abuse at the hands of her husband for a long time, but he had done nothing. In Islamic countries, divorce is perceived as disgrace for the entire family, a loss of honor. This was why Javad was so determined to find his daughter, not to save her, but to reclaim the family's tarnished honor. The search continued for 2 years, yet during that time he was unable to find a single clue about her whereabouts. Then one day the phone rang at home. Hearing the voice on the other end, Javad was taken aback. It was Mona. He calmly asked, "Where are you now?" But his daughter was reluctant to answer. She had called only because, after 2 years apart, her longing for her family had become unbearable. Then Javad said to her, "Come back, and I will grant you any wish. I promise you will be safe." How do you think Mona reacted? At that moment, she was only 17 years old. Mona's longing for her family overwhelmed her, and her father's words seemed genuine and warm. She hung up the phone and began to consider whether she should return. Meanwhile, her family was plotting in secret. All her relatives, including Sajjad, gathered to discuss the details. Mona called home several more times, and each time her family implored her to come back, crying and begging. "You must return," they said, convincing her of their sincerity. Eventually, Mona yielded to their persuasion. In February of 2022, she returned to her hometown after a long absence. She met her parents, exchanged hugs, and heard comforting words. Her father gave her a firm promise that everything would be fine now, and that she no longer needed to fear her family. Reassured, Mona saw no reason to avoid her relatives anymore. They headed home, and as they drew closer to the place of her childhood, she could see the house on the horizon. 2 years had passed since she had left this land. Mona stepped out of the car with excitement, but at that moment she froze in terror. Standing right in front of her was Sajjad, his face twisted in rage. Soon her younger brother and Sajjad's older brother began gathering around the car. They killed her right then and there. Sajjad and his brothers carried out the murder with chilling indifference. But what happened next was even more horrifying. Overcome with joy at having rid himself of his disobedient wife, Sajjad took Mona's severed head in his hands and walked down the street, brandishing it for all to see. He shouted that he had finally restored his honor, a notion that was absurd in itself. As Sajjad paraded down the streets, intoxicated by a false sense of triumph, Mona's family was busy disposing of her body. They wrapped their daughter's body in a blanket and discarded it in a secluded spot, leaving it there. Thus, 17-year-old Mona, who had returned home trusting her parents, was betrayed and met her end at the hands of her own family. It was incredibly tragic. Mona returned home, trusting her parents more than anyone, but they never intended to keep their promises. The most shocking part was the excuses that Sajjad and his family later gave when they were arrested by the police. Mona's father, Javad, stated, "Our son-in-law did everything he could to care for his wife. How could she betray such a husband who provided her with the best life?" Javad continued to insist that Mona's death was an inevitable honor killing, merely a family matter that concerned no one but themselves. However, society did not see it that way. At this point, such a murder could hardly be considered a personal matter. No murder can be justified by the concept of honor, and what is referred to as an honor killing is actually a social issue disguised as a family affair. This case shocked Iranian society, sparking a wave of outrage and severe criticism. What did the court say? The prosecutor handling the case promised that Sajjad and his accomplices would receive the strictest punishment. On January 18, 2023, Sajjad was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while his younger brother received 45 months. Thus, the case was closed. But what shocked the public most was the sentence itself. Sajjad's 8-year imprisonment covered not only murder and concealing the body, but also prior charges of domestic violence and rape. Quite a lenient sentence for such grave crimes, wouldn't you say? People were outraged, but the court's decision was predictable. This was because Mona's parents had not demanded the application of qisas. Qisas is an Islamic law that allows for retributive justice. Following the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle, the victim's relatives could have demanded the death penalty for the killer. However, Mona's parents chose not to. They did not demand retribution. As a result, the sentence was lenient, since her own parents effectively supported the killer, blaming Mona for her own death. They viewed her murder as an inevitable crime. This case once again stirred society, provoking widespread condemnation of so-called honor killings, which had long been met with silence. Although laws against such crimes have been in development for years, comprehensive legislation still does not exist. International human rights organizations, such as Human Rights Watch, have taken notice, urging the prompt enactment of laws that would prevent such tragedies in the future. This case sparked worldwide condemnation, drawing attention to the issue of honor killings. Had the Iranian authorities enacted laws to protect against domestic violence, to prevent child marriages, or if this horrific custom of honor killings had never existed, Mona might still be alive today. We hope that there will never be another Mona and mourn her tragic death.